This is the most famous post-World War II baseball card of all time. Even in lower condition, the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle is legendary. This baby is the holy grail of post-war cards and is one of the most famous cards of all time. And yeah, you know, the thing is, we call it the Mickey Mantle rookie card, even though it's not Mickey Mantle's rookie card, right? This is one of the many places in the hobby where, like, the rules that we all follow don't make any sense at all. So as you probably know by now, Bowman issued the actual Mickey Mantle rookie card back in 1951. And the truth is that Mickey Mantle was a big deal way back in spring training 1951 at that ripe old age of 19. In fact, if you go back to the summer of 1950, you can find Casey Stengel being quoted as saying that Mantle was the greatest prospect that he had ever seen. Before the 1951 season even started, Joe DiMaggio was talking to the press about how great Mantle was. In fact, even Mickey Mantle's 4F draft designation in late 1950 was widely reported in newspapers around North America. So there's this fiction that spreads around from time to time in the hobby about like why people collect rookie cards. It's supposed to like show what these guys were like when they were unknown or something like that. So I'm going to like drop some truth in you guys right now. The truth is that Mickey Mantle was never like an unknown player, right? He was always a superstar going back to before he started in the major leagues. So if we want to figure out why that 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle card is a famous card, we have to kind of look at a couple of other things. For example, we could talk about the beauty of the card as well as the beauty of 1952 Topps in general. The 1951 Bowman card looks nice, but it's smaller and the artwork is not quite as crisp as the 1952 Topps card. Personally, I prefer the 1952 Bowman card to the 1951 Bowman. Mantle looks absolutely huge in this pose. But the 1952 Topps card is bigger and it has that certain feel to it. It's really iconic. However, there really is something else going on here, and you actually already know what it is. The thing is that there's not exactly a whole ton of 1952 Topps High Series cards floating around. In fact, 1952 Topps in general is one of those special sets. This is an iconic set that changed the hobby entirely, and it's a set that was not printed to oblivion, you know, like 1989 Upper Deck. 1952 Topps is iconic in part because of the beautiful color. That's something that stands out even when you're looking at a low-grade card. Basic printing variations like the two different colored backs have enticed collectors for decades. The cards are larger than the modern standard baseball card size, and they were considerably larger than anything that Bowman had ever produced. And the packaging and displays were simply iconic. Plus, it was a renegade set. Many of the players that Topps featured in its 1952 set already had exclusive contracts with Bowman. In other words, they weren't supposed to have cards with Topps as well. Topps actually wound up losing a lawsuit to Bowman over this. This is the reason why the 1953, 54, and 55 Topps sets were a lot smaller. In the end, however, Bowman spent far too much money trying to protect those exclusive contracts in the courts and wound up leaving the card creating business altogether after the company was taken over by new ownership early in 1956. The fact that Topps won the bubblegum card wars alone is a pretty good reason for that 1952 Topps set to be so iconic. I mean, Topps did have a baseball card set in 1951, but nobody talks about these cards. They look like playing cards and they're really not attractive at all. Even the backs make them look like poker cards. Anyway, one thing Topps had going for it in 1952 was the clear brand name on the packaging. Bowman simply wrote baseball on its 1 and 5 cent packages, which were almost the same as this 1951 set. In contrast, Topps wrote that Topps name everywhere it could in huge letters, reminding kids to ask for Topps bubblegum cards, not just bubblegum baseball cards. Now, you've got to realize that the world of baseball card collecting was a lot different in the early 1950s than it is today. And you say, well, yeah, duh, because you could buy a pack for like a penny then, whereas today it's like $4 if you're lucky, right? But the thing is, back then you didn't have card displays in your Walmart or Target where kids could like fumble through packs and like sneak cards out and do all the other shenanigans they do these days, right? Most of the cards were sold back then in places like drugstores, and in many cases they were like behind the counter, they were up on a shelf behind the clerk, stuff like that. For instance, take this Peanuts cartoon from April 12, 1964. Charlie Brown goes up to the counter and asks for $5 worth of bubblegum cards. Now back in those days, you would get gum in a single card in a 1-cent pack or gum in 5 cards in a 5-cent pack. I believe 1952 Topps had the same cost structure, a penny per card, with the gum essentially thrown in for free. Anyway, with $5 worth of packs, Charlie Brown has purchased 500 cards. But notice here that the kids have to ask for the packs. They can't just like walk over and grab them. And so if you went into the store and you were like, give me 5 cents worth of bubblegum cards, baseball cards, you wouldn't know if you were going to get a Bowman pack or a Topps pack. But if you asked for a 5-cent pack of Topps bubblegum cards, then you knew which company you were getting. So it turns out that branding really does matter. And as you likely know, 1952 Topps was released in different series. The story is that 1952 Topps was released in 6 distinct series, ostensibly to keep kids collecting all season long. Like 1951 Topps, the 80-card first series of 1952 Topps was printed with both red and black back variations, though this was changed in later series. Series 2 was limited to only 50 cards. There were 60 cards in Series 3, though most of them were not star players. And Series 4 and 5 were both 60 cards each, which brought the card count up to 310. And this is where history meets legend. So if Topps had ended that 1952 baseball card set at 310 cards, it would never have been as iconic as it wound up becoming. As originally designed, 1952 Topps would have ended with this George Metcavich card number 310. Metcavich was a promising young player a decade earlier, sure, but he was never a Mickey Mantle. George's claim to fame is that he was one of over 90 Detroit Tigers players who were declared free agents in January 1940 by Commissioner Landis. I mean, it's an interesting story, but this is not exactly the stuff of legend. Anyway, there is some evidence out there that Topps originally planned to end this set with Metcavich, and that kind of makes sense, right? Bowman had printed 324 cards in its 1951 set, for example, so 310 was about right for a complete set back in those days. It seems, however, that Topps made the decision somewhere that summer to work on series number 6, and this is the series that became so legendary. The story that Sy Berger used to tell is that he convinced Joseph Shorin to let him extend the set by one more series. The truth is that Topps was already running out of baseball players by Series 5, which is why they started printing manager cards. Or in the case of Tommy Holmes, apparently like ex-manager, and I would probably scribble on the card too if I got a lousy manager as well. Anyway, there's a reason why guys like Phil Cavarretta show up in the 5th series and why the 5th series was actually relatively short printed. There are a few reasons to believe that Topps, didn't plan this one out and that the company couldn't sign enough ball players to make the set big enough. And I say that because we've actually got some pretty good evidence that Topps was signing new players while the set was being released. In fact, the most famous player in the entire set did not sign a contract until July 1952. I'm not kidding on that. Okay, here it is, the Mickey Mantle non-exclusive release form signed and dated on July 14th, 1952, and thank you to the Topps Archive blog for this. Notice that it says here that he might give the same or similar rights to others, which was a legal necessity for Topps. As you can see here, Mickey made a whopping $50 for his signature. That form was standard, by the way. Here's one for Del Rice, who was signed June 24th, 1952. So you want to know something funny? Rice's card appeared in Series 2, even though he didn't sign that contract until late June 1952. And he got number 100. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that most people don't realize and don't talk about, right? So we know, for example, that production on this set started sometime in like the middle of February 1952, but the dating of those contracts does not line up with when we think the cards were first sold. Now, is it possible that Topps, made the cards first and then bothered to get the non-exclusive contracts once it knew that Bowman was going to sue? Maybe, right? There are lots of unanswered questions here, and honestly, a lot of this stuff has been confused by legend and stories that are clearly apocryphal. Well, like Mantle, Del Rice also had a Bowman card in 1952. Now, I'm not aware of any old Bowman baseball card contracts that have been publicized, though it would be interesting to see them. We know from legal documents that Topps had contracts with all of the players that had appeared in its sets, though like I said, it's not clear why the 1952 contracts were signed so late in the season. And it's also clear that over 200 of the players Topps had contracts with had also signed exclusive contracts with Bowman. Anyway, the whole thing is a total legal mess. I can kind of sum this up for you though. So the players back then, they didn't care if the contract was exclusive or non-exclusive. All they cared about was getting paid, right? Like the players weren't going to court to fight this. The companies were going to go to court to fight it, right? Topps and the company that it bought a bunch of these contracts from, which was called Russell Publishing Company, but Topps like in general knew that Bowman already had the exclusive contracts, but they decided just to like go ahead anyway. And the thing is that the fact that Topps wound up winning the bubblegum card war in the end basically gave it that historical justification for cheating the way that the company cheated. And you're never going to find the viewpoint I just told you in any official publications or like in any baseball card guides or in any baseball card websites or whatever, because everybody's been taught from a young age to talk about how great Topps is. Anyway, there is no accident that Mantle received card number 311 or the first card of that famous series number 6. Card number 312, of course, was for superstar Jackie Robinson. This is a card famous for being miscut that is very hard to find in top condition. 313 was for Bobby Thompson, who was the hero of the 1951 pennant race with his famous home run in the third game of the playoff. And 314 was for Roy Campanella, another New York superstar. So you see the pattern, right? Topps basically pulled out all of the stops for this high number set, but it also had a lot of players that it kind of held back in reserve for that high number set. Now, my opinion is that Topps likely did not have contracts with these players until it was able to somehow sneak its way into the dressing room to start getting him. Anyway, Topps also advertised the high series as the second series. This was probably to tell kids that the cards in these packs were going to be different. And the part that most baseball card historians conveniently ignore is the fact that these cards were sold only in 5-cent packs, not in those old penny packs. In fact, those 5-cent packs were actually marked as high series because the color was different. Okay, this is what a normal 1952 Topps 5-cent pack looks like with the red and green color combination. There is no way to tell which set this is from other than that it's series 1 through 5. Meanwhile, this baby is a red and blue 5-cent pack, which indicates that it is from series 6, the high number series. And as you can see in this old advertisement, Topps advertised series 6 as being a new series. Notice also that the pack color scheme closely resembles 1953 Topps 5-cent packs. Now there's also a rumor that goes around from time to time that some of the 1952 Topps High Series cards made their way into 1953 Topps packs. This is actually not true. However, what does seem to be true is that 1952 Topps Series 6 was not really well distributed at all. This is probably because the set was not released until really late in the season, or as I suspect, until after the season was over. Anyway, this is the part where we get to the rumor that Sy Berger spread about the cards being dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. This is one of the most celebrated stories in the history of Topps, and frankly, it is not true. In fact, the earliest mention of that story appears to come from the April 22, 1975 issue of the Baltimore Sun. Not long afterwards, the story was reprinted in a fan-made publication called Sport Fan, and the story has spread ever since. Now, I don't just doubt the veracity of this story. I'm flat out telling you that Sy Berger created it and that it was a lie and that he decided to go with it because it sounded pretty good. I can guarantee that this story is false because this would have been an absolutely ridiculous business decision and a poor business decision made by somebody who was actually very good at making good business decisions. I mean, the cost of renting the barge strong enough to carry 2 million cards, which is what he claimed at some point in time, right? That alone makes this a ridiculous proposition. Now, before you say anything about it, I do realize that the Atari E.T. landfill story was actually true. Of course, E.T. was not the only game that Atari buried, and the reason for the burial was because Atari had wildly overestimated the market. Now, we know that the 1952 high number series was rare precisely because they were identified as rare as far back as the 1950s. In this March 1959 publication by Card Collectors Company, notice that no high number Topps series are listed. Now, this is where I really need to slow things down a little bit. Now, I'm going to admit to you, I'm not like a card dealer, I'm not a seller, I don't have a store, I've never run a baseball card store, and I sure as heck didn't run one in the 1950s or 1960s. However, the thing is, I understand a thing or two about how distribution worked back in those days. This is largely thanks to Chuck Rosansky of Mile High Comics and the excellent blog that he ran for years. Now, back in those days, comic book distribution was pretty much the same as baseball card distribution. Okay, the concept you need to understand here is the concept of returns. So back in the old days, comic books had a limited shelf life and stores would return unsold issues to the seller for a refund. So if the retailer wanted to get that refund, they had to remove the cover from the book and just send in the cover. That defacement would ensure that the product could not be sold so that they wouldn't double dip. And there was a lot of fraud around this in comic books, especially in the 1970s, right? Because like if you had some way to like fake, sending them back the detached cover of the comic book, then you get the full intact book and you get your money back, right? You see? Anyway, this whole process was very similar to what I used to do when I worked at a grocery store 25 years ago, right? I worked in the frozen section and occasionally we'd have spoiled product. If we had spoiled product, we're supposed to like take the cover off of it or whatever and then like throw the insides of it out, right? Because we'd use the cover to get the refund from the distributor. Now, the reason that this happened to comic books is because stores would never sell last month's comics as new, right? Kids wouldn't buy them. So in the end, there were people who started to see that there were problems in the market where you had collectors who missed an issue for whatever reason. And so they started to come up with these secondhand comic book stores to meet the collector demand for these out of print issues that were really hard to find. And of course, those comic book stores started to get their own distribution deals as well. And eventually, sometime in the early 1980s, they started to get contracts for distribution directly with the comic book sellers, right? So this is something that also has happened, by the way, in the baseball card world and Magic the Gathering and so on. This is the reason why you see people frustrated when whatever blowout cards or whatever stupid thing it is on YouTube ends up getting all of the good cards and all the good pulls because Topps is sending them cards directly and wink wink nudge nudge. Baseball cards were a little bit safer since they had a shelf life of a full year. Notice that the packs of 1953 Topps Baseball didn't have a year listed on them. The boxes did have a year, however, and there's no way a kid in April 1953 would want to buy a pack from 1952. And so Topps did wind up with excess inventory of the 1952 cards, especially the high number cards, right? You got to believe that there were some stuff that just didn't sell and that got sent back to the company. And at the same time, it couldn't convince the distributors to send this stuff, around the country because nobody wanted last year's cards, duh, right? There were certainly problems with the distribution of high number series in that year, and it's likely because it came out way too late for baseball cards. Hobby publications dating back to 1972 note that the final series was really only sold in the New York area for some reason, though this might not be entirely accurate. Rumor had it that the distributors would not sell it because kids weren't interested in baseball in late 1952, though that part probably is not true. After all, Topps did not offer a football product in 1952, and Bowman's large size set wasn't released until sometime in October. Anyway, as I've been saying the whole time, it's more than likely that 1952 Topps High Series was delayed well past early October, probably because Topps was making stuff up as it went along. This also helps explain that odd 97 card size, right? If you're planning this out ahead of time, you wouldn't print 97 cards because you don't have a sheet that has an odd number of cards on it. And then there was the fact that over half the cards featured players playing in New York and Boston, right? Now, as for that card collector's company, there's a little bit of evidence out there that Topps might have been selling excess inventory directly to that company to then spread to the market. So this card collector's company has largely gone forgotten in the hobby over the years, though it was the forerunner to the industry publications that started to pop up in the early 1970s. As you can see here, the focus was often on creating checklists, which were important for collectors in those days before the widely published hobby guides. The card collector's company would advertise in mainstream publications like Boys Life. This is sort of like how Stratomatic originally put ads in comic books. It was common in those days for stamp and coin collecting companies to advertise to kids in these kind of magazines, and this helps me understand why my grandfather was so interested in stamp collecting. You would have to look really close to find the baseball card collecting ad here. But here you go, 4 cents per card or a complete set of 1961 Topps for $15. And that's not exactly a great deal, right? Because cards only cost a penny in a pack in those days, right? So you're paying like 4 times as much to get the single that you wanted. So much for buy singles, eh? Anyway, Card Collectors Company was originally like this publication by Sam Rosen, who was a collector pretty famous back in those days. He didn't use that name though. I don't know what it was called. He passed away suddenly on New Year's Eve of 1958, which is awful. His grandson Woody Gelman then took over the card selling business, and that's where the name Card Collectors Company comes from. Now, if you're bored enough to look through old issues of the company's back catalog, you will discover that the high series 1952 Topps cards really were always rare. Alright, check this out. As I showed you before, in March 1959, the high number series was not even listed in the CCC catalog, likely because they had limited or no inventory. In 1960, right around when Sy Berger allegedly dumped 2 million cards in the Atlantic Ocean, the high numbers sold for 35 cents each compared to a dime for the commons. Jump to 1964, and the high series cards would sell for $1 each, while the lower series were 10 to 15 cents. But the fascinating thing here is this January 1968 catalog. If you look closely, you will see that CCC offered the entire high series run of 97 cards for $90 total. This is a discount indicating that there might have been more inventory than we think. Anyway, so now it's time for the conspiracy theory, right? Personally, my belief is that this New York-based company likely had a direct relationship with Topps, which was still operating out of Brooklyn, New York. In fact, my guess is that the company itself had purchased that high number excess inventory from Topps, and it was trying to take advantage of the almost non-existent distribution of that high number series to sell these cards at a big markup, selling it for like $1 a card, whereas the other cards were 10 cents each. Now, we don't know how many complete high number series CCC had, but they certainly had enough to offer the whole thing at a discount. Now, one thing we know is that Topps moved out of its old buildings in Brooklyn to Pennsylvania in 1965, which meant that the company likely needed to get rid of whatever excess inventory was left over. Though most people don't know this all that well, the Card Collectors Company suffered a massive fire in March 1975. This was just a few weeks before Sy Berger first told that story about the high series being dumped in the ocean. And we also know that well-known hobby con artists and criminals like Bill Mastro took trips down to Venezuela sometime in the 1970s, allegedly because some of those high series 1952 Topps cards wound up being sold down there for some reason. Anyway, like I said, my opinion is that Topps tried to get rid of the high series inventory through any way possible. Now, I do think that the high number series was always printed in lower quantities than the low series. In fact, we know that Series 5 of 1952 Topps Baseball was also printed in lower quantities than 1 through 4, but it was in a higher quantity than Series 6. Now, I think that the distribution fell apart because it came out too late. The stores and distributors were focused on football, not baseball, by the time the cards were finally ready. And I think that Topps wound up eventually just dumping its excess inventory off to CCC entirely. This was probably finished during that 1965 move, which explains why by 1968 they had cut the prices on these cards, right? Because you can say this card's worth $1 or whatever, or $25 million or whatever, but it's not worth anything until you sell it, right? Otherwise, it's just collecting dust, right? Now, my gut tells me that Sy Berger knew about that CCC fire, and so he had to come up with a reason why there were fewer high series cards than people expected, and so he came up with this story about dumping them in the ocean, right? It's a good story, it gets attention, every mainstream media publication has repeated it, but it doesn't make any sense, like I said, when you really think about it. So there is some evidence out there that the high number series did slowly filter out to Canada and eventually to the West Coast sometime in 1953. There's also a report that O.P. the company that distributed Topps cards in Canada, had a contract for a certain number of high series cards. Now, if Topps really wanted to destroy the cards, it would have been cheaper to just simply burn them, though honestly, it makes more business sense for them to dump them off to places like CCC for direct sales to collectors. Anyway, if you're a collector of this, you should also know to stay away from stuff like these scammy 1952 Topps Christmas rack packs, which were all made sometime in the 1970s. The mix of series makes no sense given what the distribution was actually like in 1952, and you're not going to get any high number cards from these babies. I'm going to go out on a limb and capital G guarantee you that you will not get a Mickey Mantle in this pack. Anyway, like I could go on with this. I think you get the picture. Look, the thing is that those high number 1952 Topps cards are legitimately rare, right? But this story of like going out to the ocean and dumping a bunch of cards, it does not hold up, man. That's a bold-faced lie. The card producers and the resale companies have always had these really sketchy relationships with each other, even way back in the day, right? My honest opinion is that Topps really screwed up the planning for the high series, and honestly for all of 1952 Topps. I think that the high series wasn't sold until like mid-October at the earliest, and really nobody outside New York wanted them, and even in New York I think most people didn't want them either, you know. Distribution was really awful, and Topps wound up with like a whole ton of this inventory, and then it was 1953, and you can't sell 52s cards in 1953. And so it quietly started to slowly offload that inventory to Card Collectors Company, which was always willing to pay for old cards, and sadly then a lot of those unsold high series cards were destroyed in that 1975 fire. Now, Sy Berger's ocean story is a lot of fun. It's probably going to be repeated in the stupid mainstream press until I die, right? Just like all sorts of other stupid stories that idiot journalists come up with. But the thing is, guys, it's just not true. If you're a journalist, if you're working on a story about this and you watch this video, like, please do your research. Like, people have looked into this for years now. Sy Berger was a self-promoter, and he was a liar. So, you know, let's stop paying so much attention to Topps and let's look at the way the things really were. Talk to you later.